Joining me now is Bobby Ghosh, columnist and geopolitics analyst. Donna Edwards is a former Democratic congresswoman from Maryland. And here with me in studio, James Sample, a constitutional law expert and professor at Hofstra University. Bobby, so according to the speaker, there's nothing Congress can do to move the peace along. So, you know, they're gone home. They've gone home. The Senate Majority Leader Thune says he does not plan to have a vote to authorize force in Iran or otherwise weigh in. So my question is Congress powerless here, or is it choosing to be?
No, I think it's clear that they're choosing to be powerless. If it smells like a war, looks like a war, it is a war. But if you refuse to smell and if you refuse to look, you can pretend that it is not. It's not enough to say that there is no kinetic action. First of all, that's not actually true. There is kinetic action. American ships are shooting at Iranian boats quite frequently. And a blockade, which the president has been boasting about, which he's been calling a genius move, a blockade is an act of war. You can't do things and then say that the consequence of those things are not happening. It is a war. The United States is at war. The Congress is pretending that it is not, but that won't change the facts.
So, James, on this issue of a ceasefire pausing the clock, here is what we've heard from Democrats like Tim Kaine, the senator.
They're up on the 60-day clock, and they know it. They advanced a novel theory today that because of a ceasefire, the clock stops. But the military operations haven't stopped. We're still using the U.S. military to blockade all Iranian ports, which is an act of war. Our troops are on orders to be in combat. That's what their orders are. And so they're aware of the 60-day limit.
So I think most Americans watching what's going on and following the news in the paper would say, of course, we're at war with Iran. But from a legal standpoint, who's right?
The text of the War Powers Resolution, this act passed in 1973, is clear. It lays out three exceptions that would stop the clock. If Congress declares war, then you no longer need the WPR, the War Powers Resolution. If Congress passes an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force, that pauses it. And if there is an extended time period based on official communication from the president to Congress of an additional 30 days, that stops the clock. Think about it this way. There is nothing in the text of the War Powers Resolution that supports what Pete Hegseth said, what Mike Johnson said, or what the president or what the White House is now claiming with respect to terminating the hostilities. If the president could use a temporary ceasefire to pause the clock, keep in mind that the entire purpose of this resolution is it's a second best option to Congress actually declaring the war in the first place. It's a backstop to start with, but it is intended to be a constraint on presidential power. If the president could merely use a temporary ceasefire to get around the 60-day limit, any president could basically conduct a ceasefire for a day and engage in perpetual hostilities in 59-day installments. So as Bobby says, the claim is incorrect with respect to the facts on the ground. The claim is also incorrect with respect to the law.
So, Congresswoman, when there's a political debate over something as basic as whether or not the Iran war is a war, what does it signal about, I don't know, a functioning government?
Well, clearly, we don't have a functioning Congress at all. Mike Johnson has done more to undermine the authority of the Congress than any other Speaker of the House. He's effectively given all the reins to the President of the United States and continues to undermine Congress's authority. Look, this is a war. The President has called it a war. The sailors who are in harm's way right now blockading the Strait of Hormuz know that they are in a war. And the fact is the American people know we're in a war as well. And so Speaker Johnson's word salad and making up provisions of the law and the Constitution that simply don't exist erodes the authority of Congress and really does not support the president and his executive authority because Congress is playing no role in what we all know to be a war.
Well, that's always the argument, isn't it, James, that when you have a situation where you go against what seems to be written down very clearly and you decide not to do it. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, as I say, saying, well, we're not going to call a vote on authorizing force in Iran. Is it not just about what's happening now, but does it potentially weaken congressional powers in the future?
Absolutely. And to be clear, there is history on the side of what Majority Leader Thune is saying. And that history is a bipartisan, if unfortunate, history, which is to say that presidents as far back as Richard Nixon, who initially vetoed and then had his veto overridden with this particular piece of legislation, presidents across party lines have resisted the War Powers Resolution constraints because they want. One thing Democrat presidents and Republican presidents can agree on is they're big on presidential power, right? And they're not so big on checks and balances. That's true as far back as the difference between candidate Obama campaigning to close Guantanamo and then deciding as President Obama not to do so. But there are some fissures in the Republican Party, and Majority Leader Thune is well aware of the fact that there are senators. Today, Susan Collins said that that the clock is a requirement, not a suggestion. We've heard from others like Senator Curtis from Utah and Senator Hawley. Lisa Murkowski has drafted an AUMF, which is an implicit acknowledgement that the war that is going on lacks congressional authorization. So while he's right in saying what he says as a matter of historical practice, it's inconsistent, and the pressure is only going to build on Republicans with an unpopular war post-deadline.
And I have to say, Congresswoman, the fact that James just brought up Susan Collins is really interesting because there is a widespread belief that her seat will make a difference to whether or not Democrats have any chance at all, which is already a long shot chance of taking control of the Senate in November. And you have to wonder if someone like her is sending a message to maybe an electorate that is a little less supportive of this than most Republicans would like folks to believe. Do you think that pressure is starting to build based on all the polling that we know shows unequivocally the vast majority of the American people don't like this war and they don't like the economic consequences they're feeling as a result of it?
Well, the political pressure is going. Every time Americans go to pump gas into their vehicles, that creates even more of a pressure. And frankly, for Susan Collins, she's feeling the political pressure because of a campaign that is impending. But the reality is she doesn't really have any impact on her party. And that much is very clear, and it will be clear to the voters in Maine. But across this country, from grocery stores to gas pumps to the price of goods and inflation, Americans are feeling the pain and the cost of this war, and it is going to create a dynamic across the country that will put increasing pressure on Republicans in the House and in the Senate.
And Bobby, there's another new poll that shows disapproval for the war in Iran is as high as it was during the Iraq and Vietnam wars. Only 19% say U.S. actions in Iran have been successful. 61% say it's actually increased the risk of terrorism against Americans. So the administration obviously isn't winning its key argument, that the war is making us safer. Is there any knowable answer then, Bobby, to the question of how long the president will continue with a war that has no significant support and is decimating the party's prospects in November?
Well, I think the one thing you've seen with this president that he's capable of picking and choosing numbers and moving the goalposts as he goes along. So if there's an opinion poll that seems to suggest he's doing well, that's the one he'll quote. If the next poll shows that he's not doing well, he'll just pretend it doesn't exist and he'll pick another number. The one place that I would pay close attention to is the stock market, because it does seem that is a set of numbers that Trump does actually care about. He is a businessman. His family is extensively invested in business, and the stock market has a direct impact on his wallet as well as on the wider American public. So if the stock market were to begin to take into account the prospects of a long war, and if the market numbers were to tumble, then that might, and it's a very small possibility, just might change the calculus for the president. But opinion polls, he's shown that he can shrug those things off.
Yeah. And James, there are a few Democrats, highly frustrated Democrats, obviously, who are saying, listen, if the Republicans who control Congress are not going to do anything, our recourse may be to go to court. What are the chances of something like that succeeding or even ending up as a constitutional question, as some have suggested, ultimately before the Supreme Court?
Zero.
Zero.
The answer to that question is zero. And there is no chance that the Supreme Court is going to weigh in on the balance of power as between the president and Congress in the midst of ongoing hostilities. The Democrats are going to succeed, however, in the court of public opinion, and they have so far succeeded in the court of public opinion, as you and Bobby just explored, which is to say they will make their case, but they will make their case not in court, rather in the court of public opinion.